We are in the throes of the adaptation era. We are in the middle of things like Witcher, Wheel of Time, Lord of the Rings is about to start up, Avatar's on the way, One Piece is about to happen, Game of Thrones is over, The Expanse is over. So much adaptation in the air. It's like a twisted Christmas. And that's made me kind of wonder about some of the adaptations of times long past. And many a fan have asked me to give my thoughts on the Dresden Files TV show that was given a season back in the day and rapidly not loved by fans. And this is kind of an interesting case. I wasn't actually planning on even talking about the show on the channel. I was watching it out of my own pure morbid curiosity, but it's such an interesting case examination of how to create a totally fine show that absolutely betrays the source material. Because there is absolutely baggage that comes along with adaptation that if utilized right can propel you further forward, but if not properly handled, can pull you down. So we're gonna do a deep dive into episode 1, which is supposed to invest you in the character's world and potential rest of the series, and get into why it kinda works, but absolutely fails. If you've seen this show, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. Of course, like and subscribe, all that self-promo-y stuff, and let's go ahead and look at episode 1 of the Dresden Files. So this show kicks off with narration, and I don't mean to be too harsh from literally the first word, but there is a reputation around the Dresden Files that the narration is arguably some of the best that's ever happened for all of fantasy, because you have James Marsters, kind of rough in the earlier books, but later on just mastering the voice of Dresden and bringing a performance that is such a key part of the series. It's actually the only fantasy series I have ever read where nearly unanimously the entire fan base says, listen to the books, listen to them. It's actually the better reading experience. And here we get not that.
Has anyone ever tried a little magic?
Narration is done by the actor who plays Dresden, and in his defense, he does a perfectly fine job, and it would have made no sense to make James Marsters come back and reprise his role for this narration because he's not playing Dresden, despite for the fact that during this era, he could have arguably been at the right time, and with his portrayal of Spike within the Buffy show, many people did push for that, but he was not cast. Why? I don't know. I would have said it was for an age reason, because Dresden's supposed to start kind of young, but this dude's balding, so I don't know. Could have been James Marsters, didn't really want the part. Genuinely have no clue. But what we see in this flashback opening scene, one of my least favorite tropes, but fine, is an initiation where we see a young Dresden as a boy,
He's just a boy,
afraid of something that is actually moving and making noise in his closet. His father comes in, checks for him, and we get a little bit of an exposition dump that establishes Dresden as a magical child. The first episode really utilizes these flashbacks to a great extent, and unfortunately, it falls flat constantly. The final actual beat of this opening is basically Dresden pledging to kill whatever killed his mother, and it leaves an immediate impression of Dresden as like a bloodthirsty wizard. That's not accurate, especially for early Dresden, but okay. Now, when doing episode 1 and season 1, you might wonder why not just do the first book Stormfront, because it has a pretty iconic opening for Dresden, and the first book as a whole, well, the series definitely improved from there, is looked on fondly by fans. And I have absolutely no idea. I asked that question not having an answer, because it is a little bit baffling, the choices this story decides to go with. We then cut to modern Dresden, who is waking up in bed next to a woman because player? The Dresden Files already has a bit of a milady reputation around it that, again, definitely improves as the series goes on, but is plaguing the first few books. And it seems like they're just leaning into it here by introducing a character who is just there to be the person who sleeps with Dresden and then later on jealous that he's talking to another woman. I have to assume this is a stand-in for a character that is pretty significant for the Dresden Files due to a few similarities that are going on here, and just the choice to change careers, change introduction, change initial relationship with Dresden from what it is in the books, which provides tons of agency, tons of its own career path, a lot of personality, to wakes up in bed next to and works at diner and is jealous. That's quite the choice to make there, writers. But then the biggest betrayal of all happens that makes me so upset, and that is we meet Bob the Skull. I have a Bob on my shelf because I love this character so much. That is a skull that is supposed to represent this character because it's such a fun idea to have a little perverted skull assistant being there for Dresden. Here's their Bob. Why is Bob a man? So Bob is apparently a ghost that is able to leave the skull and have presence of some kind within the space, and Bob within the books is able to leave the skull when given permission, but that's the extent of it. And the Bob we get here is also just a tremendously different character than Bob the Skull. Bob feels more like a Giles stand-in with some snark than the actual character of Bob we get from the books. But what I would like to actually differentiate here is there is an actual attempt here. I don't blame nearly any of the actors for why this episode 1 falls flat, and Bob is a great example of that. The performance given is the realization of a character that feels era appropriate. This is the early 2000s TV that definitely has that, like, you know, Buffy supernatural influence going on, and they're just attempting it with Dresden. They're giving it their all. Everyone seems like they really want this to work. It's a tremendously bad script and direction and creative choices that results in this falling so flat. And even in this opening, you can see that the shots are so boring and predictable. We get a couple attempts at like some camera movement, but it just feels purposeless. There is no creativity aside from just showing you what's on the screen, and that drives me nuts. And then there is maybe the biggest betrayal of all, and this is the definition of a scriptmaker making a change from a source material purely because they think they understand better than the author. There is no justification I can possibly think of aside from just, this better. And that is because Dresden's iconic Beetle has been replaced with a Jeep. Why? No idea. Maybe later on in season 1 they explain it, but I do not care or want it. You would have gotten immediate free brownie points from fans from showing the Blue Beetle, but alas, no. And we see that his Jeep has had a boot put on it because it was illegally parked, and this actually is something that's going to be utilized later to establish a connection to Murph. Great. But in a very clear example of bad writing that is a little frustrating to me, Dresden then gets his first client, and this is going to be the initiating incident of the show, and it's just a little boy running up to him with a torn out little bit of paper, not even the full page, little bit of paper from a phone book. And this little boy is asking him, "Is this you? Are you Dresden?" It's a phone book page? There aren't photos of people in there. How is the child recognizing Dresden out in the street as Dresden? It's a phone number. What? And in an incredibly strange choice, the boy then offers Dresden $5,000 cash in hand to help him solve his problem. And of course, this makes Dresden go like, I'll talk to you, but let's figure out what the hell's going on because this is weird. Now we're gonna get into portrayal of character. Something that is very consistent for Dresden throughout the series is that he does not deny to pretty much anyone that the supernatural exists. He is publicly and openly a wizard. The only reason that the world as a whole is not aware of the supernatural is not because Dresden denies it, it's because they are unwilling to see it. It's a very important theme of the series that we as humanity put on blinders to the supernatural. Hell, there's even a book where Dresden is trying to go on TV and convince people that the supernatural exists. He is literally like, no, real. And so Dresden sits down in a diner that he goes to several times in this episode with the boy, and the boy is then saying, there are monsters coming after me. I am seeing awful things. And Dresden tells the boy, they're not real. There's no monsters coming from you. Don't give me your college fund. What? Let's talk about the multiple reasons why this does not work, because it goes beyond the immediate no, Dresden as a character does not deny the supernatural, which is just an absurd thing for him to do at this point, but it's also going against the little bit we have gotten from him as a character so far in this show, because the opening shows him as a scared boy of monsters he knows are really there in his closet. Logic dictates if you're doing this version of Dresden where there is monsters in the closet and a little boy comes to him with a similar problem, he's gonna go, it was true for me. it's probably true for you, because he's learned in the years since then that all this stuff is real. Let's compare this to the opening of Stormfront, the first Dresden book, where he's desperate for jobs. He even talks about the fact that he takes a job from some country music star in the South he knows is probably not true, goes there and is honest with him and tells him, no, there's no haunting here, you're wrong, but he still takes the job because he always follows up. He checks in to make sure people are not being with. But a little child children are frequently targets of monsters in supernatural world, who is afraid for his life enough to somehow get $5,000. Dresden's like, nah. Doesn't even really look into it much more. He's just like, that ain't shit. Continuing on, we get Dresden then calling Murph about the boot on his Jeep and being like, hey, can you get that taken off with your magical police powers? I'd appreciate it. Thanks. Which is such a worse introduction to Murph as a character than we get in Stormfront, who when she calls Dresden, showing and establishing that yes, the police want to work with him, and having him come in to look into a supernatural case makes sense. Now our introduction to Murph is Dresden calling her, seeming like, okay, the police don't give a crap about Dresden and they're just friends, I guess. And then they hang up without Murph telling him, hey, we're at a crime scene where someone's been skinned alive. Because we then actually do follow Murph for a scene where she is going through a crime scene where there is a woman who has been flayed. And she doesn't tell Dresden. That's exactly the kind of thing in the books she would have called Dresden about. This is just a weird, creative choice where it would have landed so much better if we see Dresden in his office, maybe, in a similar way building character as the beginning of Stormfront, where he's reading books, just burning time because he doesn't get a lot of work. And no, instead we cut all of that and he's calling her, giving an impression of like using his relationship with Murph to benefit himself, which he kind of does do in the books, but this is just bad choice, in my opinion. And then they can't even get the consistency of the character they're changing of Bob right, because apparently Dresden told Bob off screen about his meeting with the child, and Bob is then warning Dresden, hey, that could have been legit. Why aren't you looking into the kid? Like, dude, no, go look into this child's issue, which, okay, if that's the character of Bob you're going for, wonderful. Except later on in this episode, that is not the character of Bob that they are building. So it's just this very disconnected scene from the Bob we see later in this same episode mocking the child, and now he's just encouraging Dresden to take this job for some reason. And we also have Bob very shoehorned in, giving us a little bit of exposition about Dresden's uncle, which I won't go too deep into because it is in this first episode, but it's like a kind of severe spoiler for Dresden series, so I'll just say that the uncle thing is kind of just exposited very blatantly here. We then have Dresden calling on someone named Melissa, and he brings her to the same diner because this show wants to reuse sets. We are in this diner, we are in Dresden's place, and very few other locations, and Melissa comes in, and the woman Dresden was sleeping with has this very awkward, annoying, Dresden, who's this other woman you're meeting with? I'm so jealous. Beat when he's a consulting wizard and you sleep with him, you know this. Him meeting with females is not going to be a weird thing because he meets with what I imagine is a wide variety of people. But Dresden's a playboy. Well, women are they're so jealous around him. I want to hit on during this exchange with Melissa, there are so many Dresdenisms that Jim Butcher, in all credit, is so good at writing throughout the series, but the scriptwriter for this just kind of puts them in here and they never flow that well, and a lot of the way people bicker with Dresden just doesn't work. Like, we get a line where someone tells him like, shut up and eat your food, but mostly shut up, which is dialogue. But he's asking Melissa, who apparently has a connection to the Wizards Council, to do a off-the-record records search for him to see if there's anything about the boy or the mother that could lead to like a supernatural entity being involved. And despite her clearly saying like no, he then just kind of asks again, and then she just does it because TV show needs to move forward. They run crunch time, very, very little time. And that's one of the big issues here. You're gonna notice they do not take the time to really flesh out a lot, and instead just push through to the end, and that prevents a lot of the nuance of the Dresden world that later lets the explosion of scope really land with the viewer. None of that really takes place here, and it all just seems so basic transactional. Whereas the actual Dresden series, every time there's some kind of exchange between characters, there's very subtle world building that continually lays seeds the later series grows exponentially from. They just do not put the effort in here. After doing this search in the diner by having her eyes go, Melissa tells Dresden, no, there's nothing going on. There's nothing on the boy. It's fine. We cut to the boy, though, and we get like our, oh, the monsters are real scene, which obviously. And very quickly, we see a teacher during the scene tell him like, hey, little boy, why don't you stay after school and talk with me? And then the boy walks a little bit, sees a monster, and just sprints from the school. And at this point, both Kayla and I looked at each other and went, so the teacher's the bad guy. Because if you are aware of simple storytelling structure at all, and you're used to watching kind of bad shows and stuff, which I have made a habit of doing, you get the same beats again and again and again. And this is the beat where you introduce the villain. Like, they are not straying from the path at all. Which, to the show's credit, the original Dresden books very much so stick to a kind of mystery structure that feels a bit basic, but it's the charm of the effort in building up this world that really carries the weaker Dresden books, and you've lost that here. So you're kind of just left with like the weakest elements of the Dresden series, which is very unfortunate. But when you see the monster that actually scares the boy out of the school after the teacher goes, it is a decent design, and it's got like this raven-y appeal, which if you are not aware of like how storytelling structure goes and the subversion of the misdirect of the not real villain, you could be like, oh, that's a cool looking villain, but like if you think about it for 2 seconds, you're gonna be like, yeah, that's not the real villain. There's something else going on here. Oh, and it's got like a raven-y look, and we saw ravens following the boy, so ravens. Edgar Allan Poe villain. We then get a scene with Bob kind of snarkily telling Dresden how he could find the boy, but he's calling the boy like, oh, a snotty little child, talking down about like who he is, and I'm like, okay, then why is this the Bob who earlier was so concerned about the boy's well-being while he's giving Dresden shit for being on this case? What? But because the boy was scared and apparently knows where Dresden lives, he just sprints into Dresden's office at this point, terrified of the monster he saw. Dresden takes the boy home, where we then meet the mother, because you have to have the nurturing mother figure in the mystery, and there's a little bit of back and forth about how the boy has continually had just weird stuff around him, because of course, and alright, no big deal, let's move on. The show does one of the most frustrating things here though, where Dresden sits down with the boy and the mother at the end of the scene, and he gives him like a symbol of protection, and he tells the boy like, this will keep you safe, and he does it in front of the mother. So I'm not sure if the mother actually believes in this magic, or if it's just like psychologically something to comfort her kid, but Dresden is clearly setting up he's using magic of a kind he believes in to protect the boy. And he also references a bracelet that was set up in the opening scene to be given to him by his mother to keep him safe. So there's some kind of interesting stuff building there. As Dresden is leaving though, we see the teacher that we saw earlier arrive at the house, and they pass each other, and Dresden overhears the teacher's name being said as Whitney. Dresden gets in a cab with money that the mother gave him, and as we see him leave, we cut into a close shot of the teacher trying to step into the house, but is prevented by this ward Dresden put up. Unfortunately, Dresden does not see it, and then the teacher's like, actually, I'll be back later, because obviously the mom has no idea what's going on. And then, my least favorite, we then get Dresden back at the diner with a very different ambiance. I'm not sure if they're trying to make it look like it's a bar instead, but it's just the same diner set. But Murph comes up to him and is like, I got a case I need your help on. Even though I was on the phone with you earlier with the skinned woman in the room, it wasn't time in the story yet for you to be called into this, so I'm just doing it now. We have a skinned woman and I want your input. And Dresden's like, but my car has a boot on it. And so Murph's like, all right, we'll take care of that. Come look for the skinned woman. And in this apartment where the skinned woman was, Dresden is kind of going about trying to do some detective-y work, and on the shelf he sees a photo, and would you believe it? It's a photo of the teacher, which means there's a skinwalker in the teacher's skin. So there's Skinwalkers is what they're going with episode 1, which is not a choice I actually hate. Skinwalkers are a cool villain idea, and they're a monster that's genuinely terrifying. But the handling of it, we'll get into why, does not work. But now that we know this, Dresden's like, we gotta go get the boy. Now we need to go check on the mother and them. This is a big bad thing, because he saw Whitney, the teacher, going there as earlier in the day he was leaving. But we, of course, during this time, are cutting to the mother and the fact that there is supernatural stuff going on in her house. We see the big scary raven guy from before walking on in, and he is not stopped by that ward. Dresden arrives too late and tries to rescue the boy, but all he is left is the weeping mother, and he arrives with Murph. And then we have the complete lack of the realization of the relationship between Dresden and the cops, which is one of the best relationship dynamics of the early series, and what? This is our attempt at it. There's also a flashback in between this where we see Dresden as a kid again. His father's a bad magician because irony, and Dresden helps him from the audience to be a little bit of a better magician. His dad yells at him and is like, you gotta hide what you do for reasons, and it's not great. Clunky. Cutting back to modern times though, Dresden finds a little bit of a feather, and he's like, I'm going to use this to track down the ravens that took the boy. And he also questions the mother and finds out some interesting things. Dresden hints to the mother like there's magical stuff at play, and even though the mother just saw him give her child a magic ward and like explain magic, she keeps being like, I don't know what you're talking about. What magic? And it's like, you bought into his shit earlier, so at least you're aware of what he's hinting. But he asks her pretty bluntly, like, I found this feather. Are there birds that happen to be following your kid? And she's like, I've noticed a lot of birds. Because this woman is written like a toddler. But again, aside from very boring direction and a poor script, these actors are really trying. I can feel that. And even the performance of Dresden, which I don't really like the characterization that's going on, this guy is giving it his all. And I do appreciate that as a fan. We then cut back to like a classic Buffy type scene where Dresden and Bob are doing some research, and it just lacks so much more oomph that it really needs. Like if we cut to the comparison with Buffy, the reason those research scenes are so engaging is the chemistry between the characters, the really fun like banter back and forth, and often some really high emotional stakes that come about due to clashing personalities. What we just get is pretty just research, kinda, in the bird people.
The beacon was activated.
And the unveiling happens that these bird people don't tend to leave their nest once they establish one, so Dresden just needs to use the feather to find out where their nest is. And then Melissa from before shows up and just super panicked, like, where's the child? Where's the child, Dresden? Dresden, where's the child? And Dresden's like, I don't know, we don't have him. The Raven people took him. And then Melissa is like, ah! And then just starts tearing down his protective wards, and then just making no sense whatsoever. Melissa starts apologizing, and obviously she's evil working for the Skinwalker at this point, and she apologizes to Dresden being like, I had to do this. I'm so sorry. I had to do this. And then her skin just falls off because Skinwalker. Before you ask, no, she's not the Skinwalker. This is just happening to her because whoever hired her is upset or something. If she had to do this, and she's doing what whoever hired her wanted to do, why does she still then die? But because the protective wards are down, the Skinwalker then enters Dresden's home and very easily just takes him prisoner. Bob can't affect it because he's just a ghost, and starts torturing Dresden and giving some exposition about what exactly Bob is. We also get another flashback with Dresden establishing that his uncle reached out to him when he's a kid, and the uncle's going to show up in a bit, so there's that. But the torture's kind of elaborate. Dresden's tied up and hanging, and the entire time I'm just sitting here like, he's a wizard, and he's in his own home. We are establishing this interpretation of Dresden is so weak that if you just tear a couple protective wards down and tie him up in his own wizard's domicile, he can't do shit. And he doesn't. He does not get out of this through any wizarding means whatsoever. He is tortured to the point where Bob can't stand to see it anymore and just tells the Skinwalker the truth that the feather is going to be something that reveals the location. You just have to do some magic to track him down. Go find the boy. And then the Skinwalker doesn't kill Dresden and leaves. And Bob makes the observation of like, oh, whoever's employing the Skinwalker doesn't want you dead because obviously he didn't kill you, which gives some interest for later episodes, I hope pays off, like the whole Melissa just dying thing. We also have a cut in here of Murph talking to the mother where we find out that the boy was actually adopted. There was a priest that arranged an adoption, and this is then communicated to Dresden by Murph, which also gives away the location, now that the feather is gone, of where the boy must be, and that is with the ravens in this abandoned church that the priest arranged. But this means, well, the Skinwalker must do magic to track it down. Dresden can get there first due to this revealed information by Murph, which is actually something I kind of like. I like that the support from Murph allows Dresden to get the edge back, and even give him the time, apparently, for Bob to help Dresden make some kind of weapon that's a box. Cool. All right. Like that. We get one final flashback where we see Dresden's uncle with him and being like, oh, I'm going to take the Dresden to, wizard stuff and be involved in the wizarding world. And his dad's like, absolutely not, over my dead body. The most cliche thing ever. And then they leave. And that's the last flashback of Dresden we get. I want to talk a little bit more about why the Skinwalker didn't work for me, because it just stole the flesh of this woman. The Skinwalker is not like a seductive woman, yet it keeps acting that way towards Dresden, despite the fact that he absolutely knows it's a Skinwalker. every time they interact for the majority of this episode, Dresden knows it's a skinwalker. So why is it trying to be seductive? In fact, it doesn't even switch to that until Dresden knows. But Dresden's obviously not going to be into a skinwalker. He's repulsed by it. That's very clear. So why in the world is it written this way? And why is it performed this way? I have genuinely no clue, and yet it's definitely doing that, which is just why? Why was that the choice? It's like they're taking the lady criticism from the books, changing it because they don't have a lot of the things he says and does towards like Murph from, Stormfront in here, yet they're bringing it back in with the Skinwalker, which is a choice. Cut to the Raven people, because they're not actually the bad guys. They are taking the boy to save him from whoever is searching for him for reasons. He's a powerful, special boy, apparently. These Ravens care about that. They are just surrounding the child in this weird scene where he's just eating, and I think they're trying to establish, like, yeah, they're attempting to take care of the boy, but it's just a weird way to look, and they obviously don't fully understand humans because they just have him in, like, bare room, and they're giving him shit food, and they're like, yeah, we're taking care of the boy. Dresden then grabs one of the Raven people and, like, just shoves him against a wall and is like, I'm gonna protect the boy. I got this. Just leave. I got the boy. And the Raven people don't take that much convincing from Dresden, actually, to just be like, okay. And they try to tie it in with the themes of Dresden with his father, because Dresden's like, no, the boy needs his loving mother. It's terrible for you to take him away. He needs to be with his loving mother. How dare you? And the entire time I'm just thinking, Dresden, his mother cannot provide very real protection. These Raven people are supernatural and magic, and you're aware of this Skinwalker, but there's something else at this point searching for him that got the Skinwalker too. What's your plan here? Are you just gonna watch over the boy forever now? You've shown that you're not that powerful a wizard and can just be tied up in your own home and are no help. They're trying to offer a real way for this boy to be protected from God knows what evil. You are absolutely in the wrong, and just take the mother with you. Go with the mother. Why is no one taking the mother with you? She loves the child. She'll go with you. Just explain it and show her magic. Oh my God. And that gets into another way the show actually failed to adapt one of the best elements from the books. Dresden does a very good job of drawing hard lines for power. There is Dresden at the beginning, and he slowly gets stronger as the series goes on. But he's never starting this weak. And on top of that, the people he interacts with usually scale proportionally with him. And Jim Butcher did an absolutely wonderful job of justifying that continually. We know why he starts dealing with foot soldiers, and as Dresden practices and gets older and becomes more experienced, he ends up making bigger waves that attract bigger threats. Here it just feels like there are people around and supernatural things are happening. It feels like an episode of Supernatural, which is not the Dresden vibe. Dresden is a slow, methodic revealing of an epic fantasy world that is filled with layered beings, hierarchies, all kinds of this influence moving the narrative. And yet here in the show, we've essentially been left with Raven people. Dresden is some kind of powerful. We don't really know, aside from the fact that you can just tear down his wards, tie him up if you're a Skinwalker, and you're fine. And maybe there's some other, it's his uncle. We know his uncle. As you put two and two together, they're setting up his uncle, the villain. The uncle's one just obviously hired the Skinwalker to get the magical boy because the uncle wanted him when he was a boy. It's so apparent and obvious, whereas the mysteries within Dresden and the whys were usually not that easy to call. But after Dresden convinces them, like, I can handle the Skinwalker, we have the least climactic showdown ever. And it's supposed to be clever. But what Dresden does is he waits in the church for the Skinwalker to arrive. And when the Skinwalker shows up, he goes, hey, tell me who your employer is. And of course, Skinwalker show can't reveal it yet. Like, no. And Dresden's like, well, if you do, I'll give you super magic weapon box. And Skinwalker's like, whoa, what? And Dresden's like, yeah, here, catch. And the Skinwalker catches it. A magical item from a wizard, if that's an enemy, maybe don't catch that. That's a bad idea. And it is, because then Dresden's like, haha, you're fucked, and leaves. And then the box just explodes and kills the Skinwalker. But it doesn't happen immediately. It takes like several seconds that I have to fill in the blank here, because it's not shown to me that for some reason you can't just tossed the box away or something, and it's not just the explosion from the box, because we just see the skinwalker casually holding it, going like, "Ah," as it goes off. For some reason, I was thinking of like Home Alone 2 with the skeleton being like, it's the same vibe. We also see his uncle's outside and like watches this happen and goes like, okay. But we hard cut to Murph and Dresden walking together because no follow-up here for a lot of things. And Dresden's just like, just say the person died in a fire, and that's where the boy got saved. The person who took him died in a fire. And Murph's like, they're not gonna buy that. It seems so convenient. And Dresden's like, buy it. That's the end of that. We then just get like a cut to what looks like very much so a stock photo image of his Jeep to show the boot's been pulled off. Resolution, I guess. And then the most baffling scene of all, Dresden in his own home apparently has invited the mother and the child over. And he has like a romantic song playing in the background as he's in a nice sweater. And Dresden looks at the mother and he's like, he's special. And she's like, I know. And he's like, no. He is special. And this mother's apparently a fucking idiot because she's just like, oh, really? Okay. And he's like, if weird things ever start happening, call me. And the mom's just like, and she touches his chest at one point after being like, your father, like they talk about his dad a little bit, and she's like, oh, and it's like, just stop. And then the final shot is of ravens watching over the child because they're still protecting, which apparently you guys couldn't even protect from one skinwalker earlier, so I don't feel protection, actually. I feel like there's just bird shit outside. But that's kind of the end of it. And if you feel like you're not catharsized, yeah, that's why the show probably didn't take off very well. An opening episode really needs to provide that hook to move on forward. And all it feels like we got here is a bunch of things happened. But my personal biggest takeaway here is actually kind of a more pulled back one, because this was not a great show. I have not seen a single Dresden fan feel like this is a good adaptation of the books. But the important takeaway for me is, yeah, this adaptation of Dresden happened. But it did not hurt the actual series really at all from what I can tell. And this goes to prove a point that I see a lot of people talk about that I just don't think is true, and that's that adaptations can ruin or destroy or somehow harm original source material. Absolutely not. If a series is truly great enough to have a passionate fan base and is continually added to by an author, adaptations get forgotten. In fact, an incredible amount of people seem to have found the series because of this adaptation, so you could argue it was good for the series. That's really not what people are going to be remembering or focusing on. People remember the good more than the bad, despite what YouTube makes you think, with so many people constantly trying to make rage content and act like things are the worst thing ever, when no, this is not the worst thing ever. It's just not a great adaptation. It had redeeming qualities. People tried, and I like that. That actually was like my biggest takeaway here. Adaptations can be bad, but the material they're pulling from is not affected, especially if you already love it. And I sure do love a lot of the Dresden Files. Anyway, though, that is just my review of the pilot episode that happened. And big kudos to a lot of the actors who clearly gave it their all. This is just clearly a product of its era where the rights to shows would be bought from authors and then they would just do whatever the hell they wanted with it and not really stay loyal to the material, more so than we often see now with the Game of Thrones era. That kind of proved that strategy is not the correct one, not surprisingly. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you'd like to support what I do here. And what would you like to see me look on into next in terms of failed adaptations, original content? Let me know in the comments down below. I'm always looking. I got books, I got merch, and have a good one, y'all. Peace.